If you're new to this podcast, my name is RuthAnn. My husband Lance was a service connected, disabled US Navy veteran. He was sick for 25 of the 27 years we were together, and the last 12 years of his life, I was his full time caregiver. I've been told that I don't fit the mold of how the medical community views what a caregiver should be. And that view is of a submissive or meek person, basically someone who just does what they're told. And no, that is not me. And this view of what they think a caregiver should be is very damaging to both the caregiver and the patient. I had to advocate very fiercely for Lance because too often there was a provider who just wanted to do what they wanted to do and did not consider what the consequences would be to Lance. Or maybe they just didn't care. But the role of a caregiver is spelled out in the name, caregiver. And to me, that means giving whatever is needed, whatever is necessary to get the patient whatever they need so that they receive the best care possible. And that includes advocating for them fiercely. I do not understand the view of why a caregiver should be submissive, just doing what they're told. Throughout the years when Lance was in and out of the hospital, I found myself saying many, many times to his providers, most often the residents, that Lance was not a story in a book. He was a human being who had feelings. That just because they read something about Erdheim-Chester disease in a book, literally, there are like 3 paragraphs about Erdheim-Chester disease in the medical literature. I don't know how it is now. Maybe there's a little bit more now, but I would hear that a lot from the residents. I read about this in a book, and they'd be so excited to see him because of how rare the disease was. But there were so many of them who believed that they were the expert on him because they read about this in a book. At this point, Lance had been sick for 15 years already. Pretty sure that we were the experts on Lance, not any of the residents or the doctors that saw him. They didn't know anything about him as a person. They didn't know anything about his life. And they didn't know anything about what a day in his life was like. I recognized from the very beginning of when he started all these hospital stays that I was looked down upon by a lot of the medical profession. Again, a lot of times it was the residents, sometimes it was the doctors too, sometimes it was the physician's assistants. But I was looked down upon because I didn't have a medical degree. And that meant I had to fight even harder to advocate for him. But it was exhausting, and I nearly killed myself doing it. And as I look back, I can say I would do it the exact same way. Most caregivers and patients don't have that kind of energy to fight, though. And it is completely unfair how caregivers are treated by the medical establishment and by medical professionals.
I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about having the energy to fight. And in that is the conversation of prioritizing what is worth your energy, what is worth fighting for. And for most people, prioritizing your energy and where to expend that might be a little more straightforward and obvious than when you're dealing with someone with a very serious illness. And as a caregiver, every single thing could mean life or death. So it's not exactly obvious how you would prioritize those things when there's so many unknowns. And is this worth fighting for, or is it not worth fighting for? Is this worth putting in extra energy or not? You can't know because you don't know the effects of all those things. You can't necessarily prioritize things when every single element could mean life or death for your loved one. So I think that's an even more significant part of that conversation is not only are you expending all this energy fighting, you don't get to pick and choose your fights. We say pick your battles. You don't necessarily get to pick your battles in a caregiving situation because you have no idea of knowing which battles are more important than another battle. And it also, I want to make a point too, as we're talking about Lance having this ultra rare disease that they had only read about in a book. I think there's probably a flip side to that of someone who's dealing with something that is more common. And their issue is they're being dismissed, right? Because that provider has seen this a million times. And here's what worked. And this is the treatment option. And this is the path. Here's what you need to do. Not recognizing that patient as an individual and their situation as unique. It can get them on a path of, well, this is how you treat this disease. Here's step A, step B, step C. Just follow this. They don't get any individualized care or attention. They're just like put on the assembly line conveyor belt, right? To remission or wellness or whatever it is, without viewing that individual as an individual. So I would say as a caregiver, it can be both ends of the spectrum. Either your loved one is viewed as an experiment, what you experienced with Lance, or they're put on an assembly line and there's no individual care being paid to them. Now, with all due respect to the medical community and everything that they see and deal with on a daily basis, I can understand how challenging it would be to provide that consistent individualized care for every single patient they have. But that's your job. That's your job.
Well, and I can see how it's easy to get burned out on that. And that's why it's so important for caregivers and patients to stand up and advocate for themselves, because you're the only one that knows. You as the patient, you know what is really happening inside of your body. You know how you feel, you know how you react to things, you know the problems that you're having in your daily life. So if something isn't being addressed at the appointment, you or your caregiver need to stand up and you need to say something. You need to speak. And it is not only okay to speak up, it is essential, because you are the expert on you, or you are the expert on your loved one that you are caring for. The provider is not the expert on you or your loved one. They're the expert in whatever field they're working in, but they are not an expert on every patient that they have. Every patient is their own expert. And something that I was thinking about as we were discussing this topic was, we advocate for ourselves in situations all the time. It's not just in the medical community. It's not just when you go to a doctor's appointment. If you have a food allergy and you go out to a restaurant and you tell your server that you have an allergy to this and they take it back to the chef doesn't look at something and go, I have never seen anyone have an allergy to that before. They don't have an allergy to it, and just cook it however they want to anyway. So I don't understand why in the medical community that was the kind of responses that I got.
I totally get that. And, I've been fortunate enough to not be in a position where I was dealing with a loved one with medical issues. But when I was preparing for this episode, I thought a lot about my kids, raising my kids, and the education system. So that was the best kind of parallel that I could come up with, because that's again that same dynamic of the professionals and then what they see all the time, what they deal with all the time. You're dealing with burnout, you're dealing with experimentation, you're dealing with cookie cutter, all those same things. So I had to advocate for my kids so fiercely. That is not what they need. And there was this pushback. I'm an educator. I know what your kid needs. Clearly, you don't, because you're not listening to me, who is the expert on my child. And that's what you were facing with Lance, is an expert in their field, assuming that they're an expert on your husband. Those are two very different things. There needs to be collaboration between the expert on the disease or medicine and the expert on the human or the individual. And that needs to be conversations, it needs to be questions, it needs to be collaboration rather than the caregiver assuming a subservient role for the medical provider to do what they want.
Right. Because at the end of the day, the people who are affected by this are the patient and the caregiver. So, caregivers, patients, I encourage you, advocate for yourselves, advocate for your loved ones, stand up and say something when something is not right.
You have to. You have to if you want to be successful. And that doesn't matter if, like I said, you're advocating for your child in their education or you're advocating for your husband in his medical issues. It does not matter. You are the expert on that person that you love, and nobody loves them and cares about them more than you do. So you are the expert. Do not ever let anyone tell you that you can't know or you don't know, because you do. And to even take that a step further, you're the expert on yourself. So if you're the individual, if you're the person that is needing medical treatment and you're going to appointments and being told how you should or shouldn't manage your disease, you have to speak up. You have to advocate for yourself because you are the expert. That medical provider or whomever is an expert in their field is not the expert on you, because you are an individual. So always you have to stand up and advocate for yourself, because nobody else is going to.
I love that. Great points, Jenna. Well, thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.
All righty, we'll see you. Bye.